Alright, I'm making this video because I've seen a lot of them out there that aren't too clear on how to do things, or they assume that you know too much already. This is a Ford Focus ZTS, and what I'm going to show you real quick is the easiest way to test the EGR system and every component in it, because that's a frequent code that comes up in these things. The easiest way to do it, I'll put a link in the description to a web page that pretty much describes it, but I'll go over it real quick. The first thing you have to do, this is a 2.0 liter by the way, is with the car running, you're going to need a vacuum gauge, which if you don't have one, you can get one at AutoZone, you can rent it, a multimeter, and that's pretty much just about it, besides a screwdriver to later take this hose off. But right now, all we want to do, this light, I hope you can see, the EGR valve itself is under here. The car is running. I'm going to unplug the hose off the EGR valve and put a line on there that I have coming from the vacuum tester. Alright, it looks like I got that on there one-handed. I thought I'd have to put the camera down for a minute. First thing you want to do is apply a small amount of vacuum. What this should do is just what it did, make your vehicle stall. Now, while you're doing this, you can notice you don't have to put a lot of vacuum on these things because you'll blow out the diaphragm in them. But it appears, I gotta check the connection, but it appears that I have a small leak in my diaphragm because it's supposed to hold the pressure. I pump it up to 5 and you see it slowly dropping. Now I see my batteries are dead already. So I'm going to switch batteries real quick, and I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back with new battery. And I put a shorter hose on here. And you see it. It's doing its job. But you really got to make sure that these hoses on these things are on here tight. So I'm going to look into that more. If it's actually got a leak, that means, unfortunately, I got to pay $97 for a new EGR valve, which I don't want to do. Alright, they're going to try to sell you a DPFE sensor, which is this right here. Now, on the website link that I'm going to show you, they have a couple different kinds for Fords. There's a problem. This is a common Ford problem. On here, if you can see, this connection there is top wire, a middle wire, and a bottom wire. The top wire is what gets signal from the CPU. The middle wire is the ground, and the bottom wire is a 5-volt continuous power source. The only one that we need to test with the engine running is the very top wire. Now, something else that's going to make this a hell of a lot easier for you is a regular sewing needle, because you want to test this with it running and plugged in. Now, you can buy things on Amazon to hook up to your multimeter, so it actually puts a little hole in your wire and test it that way. But if you want to spend $12, go ahead. This will work the same way. What we want to do with this multimeter is turn it on, get it out of the sun so you can see the thing. That didn't help. There it goes. And set it for DC volts. Now, you want to put your negative wire on a good ground, but in these cars anyway, it's so damn close, you can just put it right onto the negative terminal of the battery. Now, since I have no capable cameraman to help me do this, I have to put this camera somewhere where you can see how I'm doing. And maybe you'd want to see the results on here better. What I'm actually going to do is the top wire, I am going to push this pin into it just a little bit, and then I'm going to touch my red probe onto that. Now, what will that do? When I'm idling, it's going to show up as either 1 volt or 0.9 volts on this meter. And as you apply vacuum to the EGR valve with your vacuum tester, it's going to jump up anywhere between, it should jump up between 3.5 to maybe upwards to 5 volts. Usually 4 point something. If it does that, that's a good thing. So, really need a cameraman here. Next to impossible to film yourself. Alright. Turning out worse than I planned. Let me set this down for a second. It'll probably fall into the motor. But what happens, I'm going to stick that plug in the top wire of the DPFE connector. I'm reading 0.98 volts. Now, if I could hold this camera in my mouth, I could show you, but then you pump up the EGR valve, and it stalls out right away. But it briefly jumped up to 4.3 volts before it died. Now, let me turn this off so we can get a better idea of what we're doing, because the rest of the tests we can do without the engine running. And I'm going to take off that air tube there from the air cleaner so we can see what we're doing. Alright, see, I moved that hose out of our way so we can see what we're doing. First thing they're going to try to sell you, like I said, is this DPFE thing for $61. Now, it's a common problem, but you can test it. We already tested its response. Now, with the car turned off, the multimeter turned back on at DC voltage. And I thought I lost my pen. What we want to do is test the very bottom wire on here to make sure it's getting 5 volts. Alright, sorry about that. Wife came out to bother me. Alright, we got our pin stuck into the third and lowest wire, like I said. With the engine off and the key forward, we touch our positive to this, and if you could see my multimeter, it's reading exactly 5 volts. That's what we want. So the top one gave us the response. With no vacuum, it should run at 0.9 volts, and when a vacuum's applied, it should go up to maybe 4.5 volts at the most. Now the middle one is the ground, so I got to switch these leads around. I put my red one on the positive terminal of the battery. I'm going to stick this little pin into the middle wire, which happens to be black because it's a ground. Again, with the key turned forward, when you touch this, I'm reading 12.1 volts. So, we're getting a 5 volt on the bottom wire that we test with the positive a 12 volt on the middle, which we got to test with the negative prong. So basically that's telling me my DPFE sensor is working right. So now, right underneath that, again, I hope you can see this. Here's where your DPF plugs in. Right under that, there is the EGR solenoid, which operates in response to the CPU telling it how much vacuum to apply. There's a constant source of vacuum that comes in on the lower hose, and the upper hose runs over into your EGR valve, and the amount of vacuum is supplied by the signal it receives from the CPU. But we have to make sure that this is getting voltage first. Best way to do that, I hope you can see, there's 2 wires that go into there, a left and a right in this case. You want to plug your black probe back into the negative terminal, and then stick your pin into the right wire here, and stick your red probe on there, and I'm reading 12.1 volts. So this is getting voltage. If you weren't getting voltage, you better check your connections and everything like that. So there is another test that we actually do to see if the EGR solenoid is working properly, but at least we know it's getting voltage. So the next test we actually have to do, I have to turn this camera off and rig up my vacuum connector. And basically this hose that goes into here, but what you can do is just unplug that off of the EGR solenoid. You've got to plug the hose from your vacuum tester, onto the top supply line that goes to your EGR valve. Now this is going to look crazy, but you also have to run this up, because you got to drive around with it. Alright, what I did here, I plugged that into the top supply line for the EGR valve. Here's the supply line just hanging there. You don't need it. Now this car, the hood sits very tight around here. Make sure your tube kind of goes through this middle section. I have it sitting up here so I can see that gauge when I'm driving down the road. Solenoid as it's actually driving. Now this has to be done on a warmed up engine, and I have to put this hose back on to the air box because with the mass airflow sensor and everything, this car will not run without that hooked up. So I'm going to turn this off, hook that back up, hop in a car, and we can go for a ride, and I'll show you how that meter is supposed to read as you drive down the road. Alright, I'm back in the vehicle, and like I said, this has to be warmed up for this to happen. That doesn't mean that your water gauge is reading warmed up. It means that the engine is warmed up, or it's not going to trigger the EGR solenoid to work properly. So let it warm up, drive it around a little bit, get the engine hot before you try this. Now I got this thing there. Right now it's hard to see, but it's reading 0. Now just revving it, you're not going to get much response out of it, because the EGR sends a vacuum, the solenoid sends a vacuum to the valve during acceleration and during if you're driving at a steady pace. And the second that you take your foot off of the gas or decelerate just a little bit, the vacuum will drop right back down to 0. That's just how they're supposed to operate. So we're in gear. We'll try to hold this steady, not kill anybody. Now, if you can see that, it's going up. Now, as soon as I take my foot off of the throttle, it goes down. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, I'm accelerating a little bit, but like I said, it doesn't do it unless you're really accelerating from a stop, or if you're traveling at a steady pace. So here I come from a stop. See it go up. For some reason it dropped down. There we go. Now I had to take my foot off the accelerator so I don't kill anybody here. But it seems like it's working properly. Here we go, accelerating again. See, now we're driving at steady pace. I had to take my foot off the throttle. Now we're going at a steady 25 miles an hour. You see the vacuum gauge is up. Now I'm coming up to a light. As soon as I take my foot off the gas right now, you see it drop down. That is exactly what the EGR solenoid is supposed to do when it's working. Now, when accelerate, you'll see it go back up. Now, the thing I said about these running that hose through the back of the hood, especially on this Focus, I don't know if all Fords have the same kind of diagnostic procedures, but it'll pinch the hose unless you're really careful, and you pinch that hose and you're not going to get an accurate read on this vacuum gauge. So, see, I'm accelerating, it's going up, take my foot off, and it drops right back down to 0. Exactly what it's supposed to do. Now I'm just doing about 5 miles an hour through my alley here, but you still see it accelerate. When I accelerate, it goes up. So that's working fine. But like I said, just sitting here and revving the throttle, you get a little bit of response out of there, but it's really not supposed to draw vacuum on the EGR valve unless you're accelerating or driving at a steady pace. So that's what it's doing. It's supposed to be doing that. The DPFE valve is working. The ERG solenoid is working. I may have a small hole in, there's a diaphragm inside of the ERG valve, if you don't already know that. That is supposed to hold vacuum, but I'm going to recheck that, because you got to make sure that your connection from your vacuum pump here onto the ERG valve is airtight. Because like I said, you don't have to put a lot of vacuum on that. If you do, you're going to blow up that diaphragm in there. You're going to tear it. It's made of rubber or something. And what it does is it opens up a port where the ERG valve connects to the motor, and it allows the exhaust gases in the crankcase to be sucked out by the vacuum that's being supplied by the ERG solenoid. And like I said, the solenoid gets its commands from the CPU. The CPU gets its commands from the DPFE solenoid. So it seems like everything's working on this car. I might have a small leak in the EGR valve, but I'm going to test that again. I'm not going to go out and buy a $100 part for no reason, but I hope this helped. I got a couple more videos I'm going to make and try to enlighten you on some other things that are pretty easy to do, but the videos that are out there aren't very clear, and they don't show a whole lot of detail. They assume that you're a mechanic to begin with. So you see, I got 140,000 miles on this thing. I just bought it a couple weeks ago, and I'm discovering the wonderful life of living with a Ford, because this is my first Ford car, and they're prone to a lot of problems. I'm probably going to make another video on a homemade smoke machine that I had to make to test for a vacuum leak, which was impossible to find. I did find it with my smoke machine that I made for $14, and probably there's something else that I'm forgetting, but I'll make more videos. Thanks. Alright, the whole purpose of making this video was to make it idiot proof, so I better explain to everybody. When you unplug your vacuum thing, like I said, off the bottom port here, make sure that get this thing out of the way. Make sure that you plug your hose for your ERG valve back in to the upper port right there. Now, get this junk out of the way, and the rest will be for another video.